Welcome back to Smart Sustainability. We're halfway in the show and we have a lot more to talk about. So, Michael, we're right back here. I want to pick up the pace here a little bit. You talked earlier about US-China relation, well, US in general, that we have so much debt. I want to talk about or explain to our viewers then what actually debt to GDP ratio means, because there is so much talk about, some people are really concerned about the big debt level that we have. And some countries have almost 150, 160, 200% debt to GDP, which means they're never going to be able to pay the debt back. But from what you said was that practically, so whoever the creditors are, they can't just show up at this country and sort of demand the money back. So are we fussing over things that aren't worth fussing about?
To some degree, yes. It is. We are under conditions where clearly we have spent much more money than we were planning on a public level, even only a few years ago. But we're not doing this. There's always, to some degree, the issue of what is a sensible expenditure and what is a nonsensical expenditure. For example, should we invest in infrastructure? And if so, what kind of infrastructure? Or should we invest in, in candy factories? The whole notion being money, capital is not worth less. It just has to be employed very carefully to have a resulting benefit for society, for companies, for individuals. And to some degree, especially in the past few months, with COVID, we have made major expenditures to a great surprise of many. And we have to, of course, think about how and who is going to pay back these expenditures. How do we make sure that the money is used carefully and sensibly? And that also includes collaboration with individuals who have been exposed to the unwillingness or inability to keep going and therefore needed to draw down money which was supplied by the federal government. But what needs to be done as an encore? What happens after COVID with the individuals who have taken out loans, who owe money, and who don't have ready cash in hand? And here it becomes difficult to start planning unless we have a plan in our minds. What can people actually do? Do we leave them high and dry saying, now you owe all this money? Or do we tell them that if you invest in expanding your bakery, expanding your product development, expanding the technology you use, if all these actions are being taken together with assistance from people who know what they're doing, so I could perfectly well see that big companies like Morgan Guarantee, that Goldman Sachs don't just work with the mega rich, but also work with people, with companies which may be a degree or two smaller, but who need help in applying money soundly in order to be successful in their business practices.
But we live in a new world, so how would those companies know what they're doing? It seems to me they don't seem to know what they're doing either, because we live in a new world with new parameters, so how can we trust anyone? We can't.
Well, you're being a bit harsh, because yes, it is a new world, and yes, we need to learn. But on a simple, small basis, at many businesses, we've had occasions to explore what works and what doesn't. And that, for example, with universities, who do we admit? How do we admit them? How do we let them apply? And how do I actually teach people? All these are new conditions where I don't really know, should I teach my students with a mask on, or should I have many small breaks versus one big break? Can I still make jokes in the distant learning classroom? All these are issues that sound simple, but they do have to be learned and to some degree even relearned if one sees after 15 minutes of teaching that, hey, this isn't working. They're getting bored, they're turning away. Then how do I adjust my teaching approach? And the same thing happens if I'm a baker, if I'm a candlestick maker. How do I need to adjust my approach to business and to my clients? How do I communicate with them? How do I convey to them that now they can pick up food from roadside? And how do they need to handle the food that they take home so that it doesn't die on the vine, so it doesn't get to be old food very quickly, but it gets managed well? So these things we all have to learn and make sure that the right thing.
So everybody has to learn from everyone, it sounds like. Now, I want to talk a little bit about regional hotspots. Where are we as US consumers currently dependent on in terms of global trade? What are some of the key goods that when you go to the grocery store that you would advise our audience or people who watch to look out for in terms of how those countries or how the economy in those areas develop? Well, what about, so let's go around actually. What are some of the hot spots in Europe to look out for?
Well, I mean, to some degree, the commonality is toilet paper, right? That's what everybody mentions is the hot spot, so to speak. But we're looking as a major sector, we're looking at pharmaceuticals.
Okay.
We're looking at automotive. We're looking not as a necessarily captured consumer sector, but industrial sector. Airplanes certainly play a major role. And then we have to look at how are these sectors serviced? How is, for example, how is supply chain management carried out for these sectors? How about logistics so that they can be certain to have products available when customers come in to buy them?
Yeah, but that's for sort of when you're in the US. But what's important for me as a consumer, I would like to know what are some of the countries that I need to watch out for where I know we're going to import goods and services from that may become short. And no, I'm not advising anyone to stock up on toilet paper, but what are some of the areas that we really need to look out for? So I know, for example, when we spoke first, you said fresh roses were coming from Africa? So,
yes, there are. Many fresh roses, of course, come from Latin America.
Yeah.
But you also have a lot of fresh cut flowers imported from Kenya and from Abyssinia. And that means that we have to think about transportation, which is not anymore as clear cut as it used to be, but also substitution. Maybe instead of getting products from Kenya, how about getting them again from the United States or from nations much closer located in Latin America for flowers? But you also can ask yourself, where should I get bread from? Where should drinks come from? Are we talking about Mexican drinks, or are we talking about Canadian whiskey? So you have different options, but it's not necessarily a ongoing question of, are we running out because right now we're not running nor are we out. But it means for the US, we can think about what products should we have in store. For example, I talked the other day to a group producing whiskey and finding out very quickly that whiskey sales were quite decent, but the real growth was in a cleaning agent for avoiding contamination.
Yeah.
And so they shifted gears and stopped producing whiskey or reduced producing whiskey. And instead, everybody could buy their bottle to take home and clean oneself before sitting down to dinner.
Yeah, that's certainly a shift. So are there any other, what about fruits, vegetables, food particularly?
Well, keep in mind that we often have to ask ourselves, why do we have to have certain fruit at this time?
Yeah.
Because it may run low or may run more money. And the answer often is not that we have to do certain consumption at one given time. This is, for example, apple season. Does it make sense to consume apples year round? Well, if you listen to doctors, maybe not. But if you look around, the apple consumption can be driven by its availability in nature. I talked recently to some Europeans who told me about their Spargelzeit, which refers to white asparagus, which they consume and concentrate in consumption because they know it's only available for 1 month.
So that would mean that we have to switch our own habits a little bit and actually go more in tune with nature than against if we don't want instant gratification. So when we come back, we continue and talk more about global economy and how it impacts us. Stay with us. Welcome back to Smart Sustainability. I'm Nicolette Devidar. We're in our last segment, and we have two major things to talk about here with my guest, Michael Sinkota. The first one, so we went a little bit around the globe in terms of where are interdependencies. So I know you mentioned before the biggest interdependency is probably pharmaceuticals. Now, when we think about pharmaceuticals, do we automatically think China because this is where the drugs are manufactured, or where are we on this?
Well, it helps to think a lot about China. It's certainly not the only option. There are other Latin American nations which produce many pharmaceutical products and products which are part of our own domestic scene, let's say, automobile windows. But we also have lots of other Asian producers, take Vietnam, who are quite successful at producing new products, better products, which compete very successfully against US products. And, you know, the whole idea of, I think, our interaction with companies is we try to let them see what happens.
What do you mean
Then
by
we
that?
add to that. Beg your pardon?
What do you mean by that? We try to let them see what happens.
Well, as we look around the globe, and as we look at corporate activities and also individual government also activities, we try to help them understand by showing them what happened. And then as a next step, by essentially understanding what happens, how do they do things, why do they do things? And then finally, if possible, making things happen. I think we have lost out a little bit in the United States on the making things happen part. And we have to regenerate our capability and our interest in making things happen.
In other countries?
In other countries, but mostly in the United States. But if we just say more needs to be produced in the US, that's helpful, but we need to learn more capability on how do we make that happen. I talked to a student of mine who produces, his father and he himself produces wooden furniture. And the question then became, how can he and his family apply the wooden furniture which they make in the United States so that they can sell it abroad? Because it's not intuitive that people abroad come looking for furniture. On the other hand, when I think back, there used to be in North Carolina a lot of industries which concentrated on wood production and selling of wooden goods internationally. That has fallen a bit by the wayside, but there's no reason why it shouldn't be revived, why new things shouldn't happen again.
So what do you think about US-China relations? Coming back to US-China, now we have a big election year, obviously. How would you expect or anticipate our relationships between Washington and Beijing going to be affected going forward?
Well, that's a tough one, and we have experienced in the past years opportunities and attempts to make directions possible, but keep in mind that China has developed its own capabilities, its own directions, its own strategies. China is not anymore, as it used to be for a long time, responsive to what the US is doing, but China is doing its own thing, and it's doing so quite successfully. And very often we in the US are way too slow in anticipation, in making things happen on our end. I'll give you one example which really got me all charged up. In 1890, there was a meeting of the International Postmasters Union. Everybody who was a postmaster in charge of stamps and shipping got together there, and the US went there, and China also went there. Remember, 1894. And China made an appeal that it was a underdeveloped nation, that it didn't have enough money, and it really wanted to participate in trade. Everybody understood and nodded and wanted to be helpful, and therefore developed a new category of cost of shipping for China especially. And the idea was that Chinese cost of shipping to the United States would be kept at 20% of regular cost of shipping. Now that seems reasonable. You're helping a poor country. Guess what? As I looked at the data for 2000 and 2010, I investigated how much did China pay for its shipment of goods to the United States. And lo and behold, they were still operating under the same agreement from 1894, sorry.
Yeah.
And when you look at that, you have to stop and say, somehow this is not right. Why should Chinese be able to ship at much lower rates than US companies?
Yeah.
Especially under conditions where China's participation in world trade is much more active and much more successful than ever before. So I sat down and wrote an editorial about that. And within days, I received more than 3,000 letters and comments of people saying, you're right, this should no longer be the case.
But has it been
And
changed
I'm happy
since then?
to report that the president of this fine country decided to have the US leave the International Postmasters Union without continuing this preferential treatment.
Yeah, that's interesting. Now, in terms of global trade, having this being an election year and this being an election year like none other before, so to speak, let's talk a little bit about different scenarios in how the global economy or global trade is likely going to be affected. So depending on who the winner of the election is. So what happens if, for example, Biden wins? Can we anticipate major shifts in the global economy and in global trade?
Well, it depends how one interprets the need for action and how one learns to take action. And if you look at our two candidates, one has to conclude that at least at this stage, President Trump has a much better understanding for steps to take to right wrongs, to speak, especially with China, than many other people. And I would expect that a Trump win would allow for a clearer, better, neater transition than a Biden win. But these are very soul narrow examples, because we have to understand that over the next 4 years, of course, new issues will emerge and will need to be taken into account. And on my end, I must say that it's very likely that these new issues can be better handled by the establishment of groups, advisors, counselors, which can help make a difference rather than being intimidated by the strength and push-up capability of China.
So clearly there is a need to make a stand, as it sounds like. That's for sure. So, okay, so we talked a little bit about what happens if Trump wins or what happens if Biden wins. But in respect to China, are there, in terms of the global economy, are there any major shifts? For example, we have Brexit in England going on. So are there any major shifts that would impact or would be impacted by whoever the winner is?
Well, China has made a lot of investments and
everywhere
has demonstrated that it is willing and interested in participating directly with other countries and their plans and activities. This is particularly noteworthy in places like Africa. It is also visible in Latin America. And I would expect that China would be willing to hold itself out as collaborator of Brexit nation results within Britain, because there's the feeling that China can be perhaps more helpful than the EU would be for Britain alone.
Okay, so countries can go directly to the various different players. Now, we're almost out of time, but there's one scenario that we haven't talked about this, and that could be, so what happens if we do not have a declared winner until January?
Well, quite candidly, on a personal level, I hope that is not the case, because it's simply too open-ended and too risk-bearing.
But on a global economy, what would happen? And it has to be quick.
With a global economy, I think there are not that many current issues outstanding which we immediately have to clamp down on and repair or refashion. But given the time one needs, which is not too long, to hopefully clarify conditions, there should be enough ability to apply rules and improve relationships.
Okay, so that doesn't sound too daunting. Actually, it does sound daunting, but we'll see how it's going to go. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for coming on, Michael. And I know it was an interesting topic. Keep your eyes open to look at the global economy, and we'll see you next week. Have a good night.
Okay.